Neil Young has always walked against the grain of the world. When the entire music industry stood up to applaud success, he quietly stepped back into the shadows. When people hailed him as the Godfather of Grunge, he was somewhere on his ranch, hunched over an old car engine, fixing it by hand. And when life handed him the glory of a legend, it also struck him with blows no one could imagine. Paralysis at age 5, a family torn apart, friends lost to drugs, and all 3 of his children born with lifelong conditions. That wasn't the path of a star. It was the journey of a survivor. Yet from those fractures, Neil Young forged a kind of music that made 3 generations bow their heads. The raw guitar tone, the scarred voice, the songs that read like pages ripped from a diary, a soul torn open and stitched back together again. Behind the $200 million in wealth, the 2 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductions, and the dozens of classic albums lies another story, deeper, darker, more honest. A life of constant rebirth, constant loss, and a constant refusal to become a predictable icon. And when you step into Neil Young's world, you finally understand why someone who seems wild, difficult, aloof, ended up becoming the strangest, most enigmatic heart in all of rock. To understand how such a jagged, uncompromising soul was formed, we have to return to where everything began. A childhood without spotlights, without applause, marked only by quiet wounds, he would later turn into music. Neil Young was born in 1945 into a family that appeared peaceful on the surface. His father, Scott Young, was a well-known journalist. His mother, Rassie, was a tough, principled, soft-spoken woman. But that peace was only a thin coat of paint. When Neil was just 5, polio struck him down in the middle of summer, leaving him immobilized in a hospital bed for weeks. His left leg remained permanently weakened, and the painful therapy sessions, along with the overwhelming sense of helplessness, carved a silent fear into his young mind. A fear even adults struggle to confront. From then on, Neil could no longer run like other children. He learned to observe the world from stillness, lying in bed listening to the wind curling around the window, watching sunlight crawl across the wall, hearing footsteps in the house as though each sound were telling him a secret story. That retreat inward later became the root of his unmistakable voice. Rough, weary, contemplative, a single note of which could give him away instantly. But illness was only the first fracture. The Young family began to crumble as Scott was constantly away on long reporting trips. Tension, fatigue, and unspoken disagreements quietly accumulated until arguments tore through whatever peace remained in Neil's memory. When he was 12, the divorce came. A cold, abrupt cut. Neil followed his mother to Winnipeg, leaving behind his father and brother in Toronto. Winnipeg was wide, cold, and lonely. So lonely that the wind felt like it was gnawing at the corners of every wall. For Neil, it was both an escape from painful memories and an exile of childhood. A thin, timid boy stepped into a new city with no one to cling to, armed only with an old radio and Elvis Presley's voice each night. A fragile lifeline. In the small rented room, thick with winter chill, Neil turned to music the way someone turns to breathing. A cheap ukulele, then a worn-out guitar, then wandering through music shops just to touch sound. All of it became his only escape from the silence closing in. In Winnipeg, Neil didn't fit in. He composed. He didn't talk much. He wrote endlessly. Whenever he felt lonely, he wrote. When he missed his father, he wrote. When fear crept in, he wrote again. Childhood sorrow became his first melodies, rough but honest. A declaration that no matter what life took from him, music would always be the one place where he fully existed. And from those brutal winter days, a very different Neil Young emerged. Physically fragile but strangely resilient, carrying a fierce desire to live truthfully even when the world insisted he stay quiet. A desire that would later ignite into one of the most powerful and defiant careers in the history of rock. From those long days in Winnipeg, where winter dragged itself across the ground and loneliness felt like a sheet of ice laid over the soul, Neil Young grew up with the sense that he always stood at the margins of the world. The thin, wiry young man never dreamed of becoming a star. He simply needed a language to survive. And when he formed the Squires in 1963, Neil had no idea that those small-town tours across Canada, from school gyms to ice rinks, would become the place where he sharpened the raw, wobbly sound that would haunt his music for decades. On nights when he drove through the misty cold, the guitar echoing inside the van felt like it was talking to him about things he did not yet have the words for. At 19, while others were still struggling to find direction, Neil sat alone and wrote Sugar Mountain, a song like a letter to his own youth, filled with the sorrow of knowing that the carefree years disappear long before we're ready. That ache followed him all his life, even in the way he lived, sleeping in cars, taking odd jobs, eating sparsely just to save enough gas money for the next road. The old hearse he bought, once a funeral car, rebuilt into a crude mobile home, looked both strange and desolate. But it was the one thing he felt truly loyal to. And it was that hearse, along with Bruce Palmer, that carried Neil across the border into the United States, rolling all the way to Los Angeles on the fragile hope that perhaps, somewhere farther away, music would open another door. Then fate appeared in the shape of Stephen Stills. No audition, no plan, just a chance encounter between two men carrying the same storm in their chests. Buffalo Springfield formed in 1966 like a spearhead for a young generation searching for its voice. For What It's Worth exploded, becoming the soundtrack of America's unrest. But for Neil, it also echoed his own confusion as the spotlight grew too bright too fast. Between Neil and Stills, respect always walked beside conflict. Stills wanted control while Neil needed space to breathe. Their oversized egos, combined with pressure, turned every recording session into a battleground rather than a creative room. Neil's body began to react. Sudden seizure-like episodes struck whenever the spotlight hit him, as if his nervous system were protecting him from a role he wasn't ready to play. When Buffalo Springfield fell apart in 1968, Neil felt like someone walking out of a fire, unsure whether he still had a recognizable shape. His first solo album, Neil Young, fell into a void. Not wild enough to show his instincts, not coherent enough to make a statement. But instead of retreating, Neil realized he had to shed whatever skins were still clinging to him. And when he met Crazy Horse, he finally found the conversation he needed, not with the audience, but with the chaos inside himself. Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, 1969, felt like the first time Neil shed his old shell. The long, unpolished guitar passages, Down by the River, Cowgirl in the Sand, Cinnamon Girl, carried the breath of someone trying to reclaim a primitive version of himself. The way Neil let the guitar stretch out wasn't a technique, it was his way of holding on to the fragments of thought slipping through him. A few months later, Neil stepped into Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. On Deja Vu, 1970, he added his sadness to the group's harmonies, giving the music depth but also raising the internal tension, because Neil never walked a path someone else laid out. At the same time, he created After the Gold Rush, an album with an almost spiritual tone, where Only Love Can Break Your Heart echoed like a crack that never healed. And when Harvest, 1972, arrived, Neil Young became a superstar he never wanted to be. Heart of Gold topped the charts, and Old Man became the confession of a young man with an old soul. But the more people praised him, the more Neil felt himself drifting away from his roots, from the rawness, bluntness, and honesty he had relied on back when he slept in a hearse. 1973 marked the first time he understood that success never comes alone. When Danny Whitten, the guitar soul of Crazy Horse, died from heroin just hours after Neil asked him to leave the tour, the guilt stuck to him like a shadow that never faded. From then on, Neil's music turned toward the dark. Time Fades Away, On the Beach, Tonight's the Night, later called the Doom Trilogy, weren't works of art. They were the nights Neil sat with a glass of alcohol, trying to give fear and grief a way out. When Tonight's the Night was released in 1975, listeners heard not simple despair, but the voice of a man trying to stay upright while the ground beneath him kept collapsing. And then, finally, like an exhale after years buried in ruin, Neil returned to Crazy Horse with Zuma, late 1975. Cortez the Killer soared, long, drifting, dreamlike, sharp and soft at once, half prayer, half curse. In that moment, Neil Young was reborn for the first time in his artistic life. Not brighter, but truer. After the resurrecting breath of Zuma, Neil Young stepped into 1976 feeling like someone who had crawled out of a storm but hadn't yet figured out whether the sky outside had cleared. He kept touring, kept living with Crazy Horse, kept burying himself in the guitar to find the peace that always slipped from his grasp. But that peace was only a thin mist. Once he entered American Stars and Bars, Neil sank again into nights of drinking, into empty hours soaked in alcohol, into stretches where he felt his heart dropping like a heavy stone. Not dramatic, not tearful, just an exhausted emptiness that every artist knows too well when the creative fire temporarily refuses to stand on their side. And although 1978 brought a soft turning point with Comes a Time, a folk album as gentle as the last streak of daylight, that gentleness did not come with relief. Listening to the test pressing, Neil felt an invisible layer of dust in the sound, one that only he could hear. And so he did what no one thought an artist would dare. He destroyed an entire batch of vinyl and CDs because they were not right. It wasn't perfectionism. He simply refused to lie through his music. But the sky sometimes glows bright right before night falls. And in 1979, Rust Never Sleeps erupted like an explosion, tearing straight through everything Neil had been carrying. There, his guitar roared like molten metal, not to prove anything, but to remind him that he was still alive, still feeling, still haunted by wounds that refused to disappear. Along with live Rust, Neil unintentionally became a spiritual anchor for a new generation, searching for its voice. The young musicians who would later become Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden. But at the time, all Neil knew was this. He had taken one long, clean breath. The 1980s did not arrive as a continuation, but as a blow to the chest. When Hawks and Doves was released, Neil was not only an artist caught in the political polarization of America, he was a father spending every night lifting and turning the stiff body of Ben, his son born with cerebral palsy, able to communicate only through his eyes. No one knew that every morning Neil walked into the studio with sleepless eyes, hands trembling slightly from exhaustion, and a constant fear that Ben's condition could worsen the next day. But it was exactly those quiet, unseen moments, without lights, without applause, that became the source of the human depth in Neil's music throughout the decade. Yet life pushed him into another corner. When he signed with Geffen Records in 1982, Neil thought it would be a new chapter pulling him out of the darkness of the 70s. Instead, he ran into the cold expectations of a system that wanted to mold him into a marketable star. To Neil, That felt like shackles tightening around his soul, and as always, when pushed to the limit, he reacted on instinct. Trans 1983 was born, an electronic album cold as metal wind. His voice compressed and distorted through a vocoder like a cry, echoing from a place no one else could reach. But the deepest layer of the album wasn't the technology. It was the desperate attempt of a father trying to build an invisible bridge to the heart of a child who could not speak. Fans were shocked, critics confused, Geffen furious, and they threatened to sue. But Neil, who had survived Danny Whitten's death, seizures, and endless losses, did not fear power. Then he did the one thing no one could have predicted. He released Everybody's Rockin' in 1984, a burst of bright featherlight rockabilly that sounded like laughter thrown in defiance. And this was the moment Geffen snapped. They sued Neil Young for not making commercial music. For any artist, that would be an insult. For Neil, it felt like the industry was demanding he bow, and he never bowed. Instead, he turned toward something profoundly human, joining Willie Nelson and John Mellencamp to create Farm Aid in 1985, singing for farmers losing their land, people just like those he had known as a child. As Neil stood on the Farm Aid stage, his voice raspy but unwavering, people understood that the battles he chose always belonged to those who had no voice. That unwavering spirit had its price. During the sessions for Landing on Water, 1986, Neil was so worn down that he returned to marijuana just to quiet his mind. The music he wrote then sounded disjointed and cold, like a lake surface torn apart by night wind. The drums and bass dragged through the storm inside his head. Life, 1987. With Crazy Horse wasn't much better. Arguments, doubts, recording sessions, where Neil laid down tracks alone, like someone trying to answer the question, do I still believe in this? Yet in the middle of the chaos, a spark still flickered. Neil countersued Geffen, not for money, but to defend the right to be truthful. And in 1988, he won, a rare victory in history, where an artist defeated a record label. The moment he regained his freedom, Neil swung a direct punch. This note's for you, a declaration that he would never let his music be bought by brands or advertising. MTV was so enraged that they banned the video, only for it to later win Video of the Year, forcing them to apologize. And, as one final answer to anyone who had tried to twist his voice, Neil entered 1989 with freedom. Rockin' in the Free World rang out like the scream of a soul that had lived through his son's illness, betrayal, nights of despair, and a loneliness that never seemed to leave. The song became a torch leading the way for the grunge generation, the kids who were just learning how to scream their own pain. They called him the Godfather of Grunge. But to Neil, it was simply the natural consequence of staying loyal to the only thing he ever trusted, without question: the truth. Stepping into the 1990s, Neil Young was like a ship that had sailed far beyond the storm, yet still carried the salt scars etched into its wooden hull. He didn't grow softer with age. On the contrary, the energy inside him felt like something that only activated when the world assumed he had calmed down. Ragged glory exploded like a primal roar, where the guitar was no longer an instrument, but a tectonic jolt blowing apart every lingering doubt. The youth of Seattle had barely lifted their heads from their damp basement rooms when they saw Neil standing there, not as a solemn monument, but as a man speaking the rebellious language they were desperately trying to find. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. This was a meeting between two generations, not in boardrooms, not in interviews, but in shredded guitar tones and a shared ache over a world rotting from the inside. The 1991 tour with Crazy Horse was like a chain of storms rolling across America. Every night, Neil stood amid the howling amplifiers, his eyes occasionally closing as if he were listening to the space around him to see where his heart was hiding. The audience wasn't just watching a concert. They were witnessing a man using music to check if he was still alive. Weld was born from those nights. Not a live album, but a medical record of a soul refusing to sleep. But after the storm always comes a stillness that Neil sometimes avoided, sometimes drifted into. Harvest Moon, 1992, emerged like a soft exhale at twilight. It wasn't Neil growing old, it was Neil looking back at healed wounds and memories that once made his hands tremble when he touched them. The album was so gentle that listeners couldn't tell whether he was forgiving himself or simply dressing his sorrow in something more beautiful. That tenderness carried him into the hearts of millions. But for Neil, success was never a destination, only a brief moment that allowed him to stand still for a few seconds. 1993 placed him into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as if trying to freeze him into a monument. But Neil Young was never the kind of artist who stood still for anyone's statue. When Pearl Jam, the kids who saw him as the keeper of their musical soul, invited him to collaborate, Neil agreed instantly. Mirror Ball, 1995, wasn't a handshake between generations. It was a spiritual family finding each other through their cracks. But in that harmony came a death that stunned Neil. Kurt Cobain. Reading Kurt's suicide note, seeing the line, "It's better to burn out than to fade away," Neil felt as if he had lost a spiritual son. Sleeps with Angels, 1994, became a farewell, not weeping, not rationalizing, just guitar notes breathing like someone trying to understand why a soul so young would choose to leave the world so early. The rest of the 90s drifted like a tide rising and falling with Neil's own state of mind. Broken Arrow, Year of the Horse, Silver and Gold. Each album was like a different room in the house of his soul, sometimes dark, sometimes bare, sometimes dusty with the road, sometimes soft like cotton washed 100 times. Neil wasn't trying to shock anyone, nor reclaim old glory. He was simply living the way he always had since Winnipeg, listening to the noises of his own heart and putting them onto the fretboard. The 2000s opened like a late-life chapter in the story of an artist who refused to grow old. Looking forward with CSNY felt like a gentle farewell, not bitter, not nostalgic, just a final nod to the generation he had both loved and fought with. But immediately afterward, he veered in a different direction with Greendale, a self-contained universe where Neil used music to build a town, a family, a war against corrupted power. Greendale wasn't an album, it was a film, a stage play, a manifesto that Neil had never merely written songs, he wrote worlds. 2005 cut through him like a sudden pair of shears, severing all the ropes holding him up. His father died. The loss didn't crush him the way Danny Whitten's death once had, but it slowed him down, like a man standing before an old house, suddenly aware of how long he had been aging. Prairie Wind came from that slowing, a warm, sighing collection of things he wished he had said to his father. But the quiet didn't stay long with Neil. A year later, he sprang back like a wolf, hearing gunfire in the night. Living with War, 2006, wasn't a protest album. It was a declaration of war against America's silence during the Iraq conflict. Once again, Neil stood on the side of what was right, indifferent to politics, indifferent to being called a traitor. Hero or villain, he had never let anyone decide that for him. The following years of the 2000s were a maze of experiments. Chrome Dreams 2, Fork in the Road, and especially Lanoise, where his guitar, under Daniel Lanois' hands, became a sound like electricity running under the skin, wild and modern at once, as if Neil were saying that age only made him heavier, not slower. In 2012, the past returned to Neil in the most beautiful way. Crazy Horse reunited for Psychedelic Pill. And alongside that present came Archives, a monumental vault of memories that only artists who have lived long, lived true, and lived ferociously would dare to gather. Not a memoir, not a summation, but a reminder that Neil wanted to arrange his own memories before the world tried to do it for him. By 2015, he emerged with The Monsanto Years, an arrow shot straight into the heart of a GMO corporation. Businesses struck back, the media roared, but Neil, with the calm of a man who had seen too much to fear anything, remained unshaken. Throughout his life, he had always stood on the side of truth, even when that truth forced him to face the largest shadows in the world. In the early years of his career, when Neil Young was still staggering out of the ashes of Buffalo Springfield, his private life opened in a completely different direction. Susan Acevedo appeared at a moment when Neil was stretched tight like a guitar string, torn between craving a home and fearing anyone who might look too deeply into the dark places inside him. In that chaos, Susan became a rare anchor, a presence that made him feel less like a lost soul wandering through an unfamiliar city. Their 1968 marriage wasn't the decision of two dreamers. It felt more like an attempt by two grown souls, each carrying their own cuts, to see if they could create a temporary shelter from a world spinning too fast. Susan was gentle but not weak, practical but not cold. She saw in Neil not just a rising musician, but a man who had never been taught how to live slowly inside peace. Yet the life of an artist does not move to the rhythm of a household. As Neil sank deeper into songwriting, the nights lying awake in a lit-up room became more frequent than dinners for two. The guitar, the endless recording sessions, the half-dream state between performances, all of it slowly turned Neil into a man who was present but absent. And Susan, with the intuition of someone who had lived enough to understand, knew she could not enter the place where Neil hid the parts of himself he shared with no one. Their separation in 1970 came quietly, not because the love had faded, but because both knew they no longer stood in the same rhythm of life. Neil carried the ache with him. Susan left with a rare calm. She did not become a shadow behind him, nor an unhealed wound. She was like a brief season, warm, light, and enough for Neil to look back and know someone had truly wished for his happiness. What's striking is that although the marriage lasted only 2 years, Susan left a mark that people close to Neil still mention. She was once the only person who could calm him before he stepped on stage, the one who made him feel he didn't need to perform Neil Young, but simply breathe at his own pace. In a private life full of fractures later on, Susan became the quietest opening chapter, a chapter Neil kept like a delicate gift from youth. Susan Acevedo left Neil's life like a passing season, and the space she left behind made him drift into a strange kind of solitude. Not a heavy sadness, but an open expanse ready for another connection to appear. Carrie Snodgress entered at precisely that moment, as if fate had decided to send Neil someone whose shadows were deep enough to reflect his own. Carrie wasn't a glamorous star. She was a gifted actress with eyes that always held a trace of hesitation, someone who had been nominated for an Oscar, yet carried a sensitivity so fragile that a small sorrow could make her take a half step back. That fragility struck Neil's heart immediately. He once said Carrie was the reason he wrote "A Man Needs a Maid," a song that sounded like a confession from a man who was both afraid to love and desperate to be loved. In the beginning, their relationship felt like two broken pieces finding each other after their own upheavals. Carrie understood Neil's quietness, and Neil saw the wounds Carrie hid beneath her gentleness. They lived simply at the Broken Arrow Ranch, where mornings belonged to Neil's writing, afternoons to Carrie's scripts, and nights to circling their small wooden house, trying to lull their son, Zeke, to sleep. Zeke was born with mild cerebral palsy that bound them together in a way no one could have prepared for. Neil held his son more than he talked, and Carrie cared for him with the patience of a mother constantly afraid the world might hurt him. In those moments, they were a complete family. But love between two artists rarely holds its original shape. Neil sank deeper into long recording sessions, endless nights with Crazy Horse, stretches of time where he believed he was creating art, but was in fact neglecting the simplest things around him. Carrie felt the distance, not through words or actions, but through the way Neil dove into music, as if it were the only home he truly belonged to. The fracture didn't come from conflict, but from the exhaustion of two weary souls. Carrie later admitted she felt she was following a man running toward his own pain. Neil was lost in the darkest period of his life. The death of Danny Whitten, the Doom trilogy, the drunken nights that left him unraveling. They loved each other deeply, but not in the same breath long enough to keep the love intact. When they finally parted ways, Carrie chose to leave Broken Arrow, and Neil stayed with his guitar and the songs that carried her silhouette. The relationship did not end in bitterness. It left the aftertaste of a sad film, where the two leads walk off screen with lingering emotion, but an understanding they could not have been otherwise. Carrie Snodgress spent many years afterward raising Zeke, while Neil continued drifting into writing journeys. Yet in his music, Carrie never vanished. The soft sorrow in Harvest, the trembling in his voice during that era, songs like Out on the Weekend and Harvest, all still bear the subtle footprints of the woman who entered his life without a sound and left it just as quietly. If Susan Acquavito was the peaceful opening chapter, then Carrie Snodgress became the most emotionally rich love chapter in Neil Young's life. Beautiful, deep, yet so fragile that a single gust of fate was enough to dissolve it into mist. Carrie Snodgress left the Broken Arrow Ranch like the last streak of sunlight at dusk, leaving Neil alone across a landscape so wide that even the wind sounded like a sigh. In that emptiness, a woman appeared, softly, slowly, as if she intended only to pass by, but ended up becoming the pillar of one of the longest chapters of his life. That woman was Peggy Young. Peggy entered Neil's life not with the explosion of an artist's romance, but with the steadiness of someone who could stand beside him without making him feel suffocated. When she met Neil, he was nearly drained of emotion, fresh from his split with Carrie, anxious about Zeke, shaken by the deaths of friends and bandmates. But Peggy did not try to heal him, did not demand anything, did not poke at his wounds. She simply existed, cooking dinner, keeping the house orderly, helping Neil see that sometimes peace is not something you search for, but something that happens when you allow someone close enough to share your silence. Their love grew naturally, like a plant climbing an old wooden fence, quiet, unshowy, but steady. Peggy did not just become a partner. She became the grounding force who helped Neil understand what responsibility inside a family meant. When their two children, Ben Young and Amber Young, were both born with health challenges, Ben with severe cerebral palsy, Amber with epilepsy, Peggy turned the entire family's world toward the light. The long nights repositioning Ben's stiffening body, the hospital visits with Amber, the physical therapy sessions, Neil often stepped back, letting Peggy do the things only the strongest mothers could. It was this devotion that made Neil love Peggy in a different way, deeper, more mature, and filled with gratitude. They married in 1978, during the period when Neil was recording some of the rawest albums of his life. Yet even as his music was soaked in darkness, the home beside the Broken Arrow Ranch became the place where he could breathe fully. Peggy understood Neil needed space to write. Neil understood Peggy needed him present when the family faltered. They held each other through their own rhythm, through rare pockets of quiet between wind-slicing tours. The longer they stayed together, the more Peggy became his right hand in every part of life. Charity work, caring for the children, supporting Neil backstage, and later co-founding the Bridge School, an acclaimed institution for children with speech and motor disabilities. It was Peggy who encouraged Neil to turn his tear-filled experiences with his son into a long-term mission. The Bridge School became part of their shared heart, and the Bridge School benefit concerts brought together music legends for nearly 3 decades, all because one woman refused to let any child be left behind. For many years, Peggy was the only home Neil truly had. But every home eventually faces cracks no one wants to name. As music continued pulling Neil in different directions, as age made them see life through lenses no longer aligned, their relationship began developing gaps too difficult to bridge. Eventually, Neil filed for divorce in 2014 after 36 years of marriage, a decision that shocked fans, confused friends, and nearly shattered Peggy. For Neil, the marriage didn't end because love was gone. It ended because he no longer had the strength to live a life out of sync with his own heart. For Peggy, it felt like a chapter slammed shut. Too soon. Too painfully. What makes the story more haunting is the truth. Even after the divorce, Peggy never disappeared from Neil's music. He continued performing songs connected to their years together, continued attending the last Bridge School events, continued speaking of Peggy with a quiet respect. When Peggy passed away in 2019 from cancer, Neil made no public statement, but those who knew him understood the silence was not indifference. It was grief impossible to articulate. In Neil Young's life, Peggy was not the loudest chapter, nor the most romantically beautiful. She was the longest, the steadiest, and the most human. The woman who kept Neil standing when he nearly broke, who raised their children while he roamed, who built a place he could always return to, even when his heart had wandered too far. The divorce left in Neil a void difficult to name, not the emptiness of losing love, but the disorientation of someone who had lost a part of life he once believed eternal. In that period, Daryl Hannah appeared in a way no one predicted. Not even Neil. She stepped into his life not with the burst of a new romance, but with a still, almost meditative energy, something Neil had lacked for years. Daryl was not the other woman, nor a late-life infatuation. She was someone who carried her own inner fractures. The years battling depression, her troubled relationships with Jackson Browne and John Kennedy Jr., the long stretches of quiet, living away from Hollywood's glare. That history allowed her to see clearly the exhaustion carved deep into Neil. The weight of fame, the losses from Witten to Barry, the health struggles of his children, the battles with record labels, the years navigating between the world's expectations and a very private loneliness. Their connection happened without noise. Two people who had walked too far in difficult chapters of their lives and, upon meeting, simply understood. No explanations. No display. Neil felt a peace he had rarely known. Daryl saw a man whose surface was drained, but whose depths still held fire. When they went public in 2014, a storm erupted instantly. Many criticized Neil for divorcing Peggy too quickly. Others accused Daryl of intruding on a family. The media dug. Peggy's friends reeled. Fans split. Through it all, Neil chose silence. No defense, no rebuttal. The silence was not avoidance. It was protection. protecting Peggy from being dragged into chaos, protecting Daryl from venom, protecting himself from twisting the truth to appease anyone. Daryl chose silence too, but the silence of someone long familiar with being misunderstood. She poured herself into nature, into environmental activism, into long journeys through forests and deserts, journeys Neil often shared. On those trips, they didn't talk much about the past. They walked, letting the wind and earth retell their histories in gentler ways. Quietly but surely, Daryl helped Neil heal. He stepped away from the mental exhaustion, from the inner storms that once made him see life through heavy eyes. She took him swimming, hiking, walking by the ocean. He took her around the Broken Arrow Ranch, then belonging to Peggy, then into the Canadian forests where his childhood began. They lived like two people who found a shared language not in music, but in stillness. In 2018, they held a secret wedding, simple, without media, without show, without needing to announce anything. Only a few close people present. It wasn't the wedding of two celebrities, it was the wedding of two souls finding a landing place after a lifetime of drifting. Daryl never tried to replace Peggy, nor to step into the role of the wife of a rock legend. She built a life separate from the noise, living on a Colorado ranch, planting trees, caring for horses, devoting herself to environmental activism and anti-resource exploitation campaigns. Neil followed her like an old soldier finding a new cause. Not to wage war, but to protect. In recent years, Daryl's presence has become a different kind of lifeline for Neil. When he rewrote Big Change, when he released Chrome Dreams 2, when he fought against GMOs, Daryl's quiet strength hovered in the background like an invisible force. She became the soulmate of his later years, the one helping him keep his breath steady even as age, fame, and time continued to test him. If Peggy was the home of his 36-year life, then Daryl is the late-season porch, the place where the man who spent a lifetime running from the spotlight finally sits down, exhales, and allows himself to feel happiness in its gentlest form. As he moved into the twilight years of his life, Neil Young did not become a relic resting quietly in a museum of memories. He lived as though time were merely a vague concept, and the clearest proof of that was the way he continued to create relentlessly, manage his estate, expand his living spaces, and keep his artistic fire burning like someone in his 20s. 75 million albums sold was not merely a commercial achievement. It was the youth of generations pressed into his guitar strings, the winters of Winnipeg, the nights in Los Angeles, the world tours condensed into discs carrying his soul. That weight allowed Neil to sell 50% of his catalog for $150 million, one of the most notable deals in modern music, pushing his net worth to roughly $200 million. Yet wealth never defined Neil Young. It only reflected the magnitude of the journey he had walked. Despite considerable wealth, Neil chose a life far removed from the Hollywood star archetype. Broken Arrow Ranch, which he purchased in 1970 and where he wrote Old Man, was once the heart of his world. There was Redwood Studios tucked among towering redwoods, a rustic wooden home with a stone fireplace, Navajo rugs, and warm light spilling through windows like an endless afternoon. Life on the ranch meant Neil watering the horses himself each morning, gathering eggs from the coop, tending to the vegetable beds he and Daryl grew. He never needed luxury. He needed soil, wind, the scent of sap, and the stillness necessary to write. That stillness came with very Neil Young pleasures, old cars. His collection resembled a museum of vintage Americana, from the Lincoln Continental Mark II, Jeepster, 1949 Cadillac, 1953 Buick Skylark, to the 1950 Plymouth. Each car was a chapter of history, a memory preserved in metal and engine oil. But what set Neil apart was not just collecting, but creating. The Link Volt Hybrid, a Lincoln Continental he personally helped convert into a hybrid, a declaration of his environmental devotion. Then there was his world of model trains, where he was not merely a hobbyist but an inventor, contributing technological innovations as a shareholder of Lionel, a passion that began when his father gave him his first train at age 5. In recent years, Neil's rhythm shifted yet again. After his Malibu home burned down in 2018, he and Daryl withdrew to the mountains of Colorado, and by 2020, Neil returned to Canada to live in a small cottage near the town of his childhood, as if, after a lifetime on every stage imaginable, he simply wished to end each day listening to wind filtering through the same wooden eaves that once sheltered a frail boy recovering from polio. It was there that he continued writing daily, continued recording, continued environmental activism. His persistence reached a new height as he entered 2024-2025 with the Love Earth Tour, a new album, and a series of reimagined projects still bearing the spirit of a warrior. Stadiums remained packed. Crowds still stood in the rain just to watch the silver-haired man on stage, guitar strapped across his chest, eyes shining as if he had never aged. That may be why people call Neil Young the last legend untouched by time. He doesn't live off nostalgia, doesn't trap himself in the past, doesn't chase the present. He simply is, a solitary, powerful soul whose voice never goes out. Neil Young's impact does not lie in album numbers nor in awards hung on walls. His legacy flows like a current that refuses to obey conventional rules. Others preserve their image to survive. He destroys his image to stay honest. That is why he became a spiritual anchor for so many who came after, from scrappy garage bands to the giants of grunge, from quiet folk singers to frontline activists. In a world where art is often demanded to be pretty, clean, and marketable, Neil Young kept every scar intact. That is why his music carries the strength of a real hand reaching out, rough but warm. He wrote songs as though recording the breath of a soul that had never surrendered. People don't listen to Neil for entertainment. They listen to find themselves. That is why he occupies a singular place. Not a distant idol, but a companion during life's most honest moments. His legacy also lies in his steadfastness. Many artists change to stay relevant. Neil changes to avoid betraying his essence. From folk to electric rock, from political songwriting to grunge, from nostalgic acoustics to electronic experiments, each pivot forced the world to adjust its idea of what art could be. He never followed trends. He created them, then quietly walked away, leaving a generation wondering how he saw the road before anyone else. But perhaps what makes Neil Young's name outlive time itself is the humanity in every action he takes. The disabled children at the bridge school, the farmers rescued by Farm Aid, the independent artists inspired by his disdain for commercialism. They are the clearest proof that Neil's legacy does not live in the studio, but in the quiet changes he left behind. Neil Young became an icon, not because he was perfect. He became one because he was real. And in a noisy world, that truth is rare enough to be precious. His life was never a straight line. It resembled a vast forest, where every trail led to an untold story and every sound carried a healed wound. He did not avoid pain or run from darkness. He used music to light the path ahead, and somehow that light spread to those searching for their own way out. People can debate endlessly about his best album, his strongest era, or the style that defines him most. But one thing is undeniable. Neil Young proves that an artist becomes truly great only when he dares to stay loyal to his heart, even if it means the world might turn its back. If this story touched you, even just a little, Take a moment to leave a sign that you were here, a like, a comment, or a heart. It's not just a way to support the channel. It is a quiet tribute to the artist who spent his entire life keeping music human enough to still feel alive.